The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. From the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker. Epigraph. A pleasing land of drowsy head it was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of gay castles and clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky. James Thomson, The Castle of Indolence. Part 1. The Hollow. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river denominated by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, where they always prudently shortened sail and implored protection of St. Nicholas, there lies a small market town or rural port, known by some as Greensburg, but more universally and properly called Tarry Town. This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley, or rather a lap of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the occasional whistle of a quail or a tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility. I recollect that, when a stripling, my first exploit in squirrel shooting was in a grove off tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I had wandered into it noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun, as it broke the Sabbath stillness around, and was prolonged and reverberated by the angry echoes. If ever I should wish for a retreat, whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. The enchantment, from the listless repose of the place, and peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are called the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, and pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in a continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the valley than in any other part of the country, and the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The Headless Horseman, the dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region, and seems to be commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War, and who is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of those parts, who have been careful in collecting and collating the floating facts concerning the spectre, allege that the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head, and at the rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow, like a midnight blast, is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. Such is the general purport of this legendary superstition, which has furnished material for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the spectre is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Part 4. Ichabod Crane. It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there embosomed in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while a great torrent of migration improvement, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water which border a rapid stream, where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor or slowly revolving in their mimic harbor, undisturbed by the rush of the passing current. In this byplace of nature there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for forest, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodmen and country schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was not inapplicable to his person. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon a spindle neck, to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. Part 5. The Schoolhouse. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a wide twisted handle of the door, and stakes set against the window shutters, so that, though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would find some embarrassment in getting out. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by, and a formidable birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices, conning over their lessons, might be heard in a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master, in the tone of menace or command, or, peradventure, by the appalling sound of the birch, as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joy in the smart of their subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. When school hours were over, he was even a companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy some of the smaller ones home, who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives or mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. He sustained himself, according to local custom, by lodging and dining with the farmers whose children attended his school. After spending a week in one household, he would move on to another, carrying all his worldly possessions tied up in a handkerchief, thus making his way around the entire district, to ease the burden on his hosts. Peasants inclined to see the expense of schooling as an intolerable tax, and the teacher as little better than a drone. He resorted to various stratagems to prove himself as useful as he was agreeable. He lent a hand in farm work, mowing hay, mending fences, leading horses to water, driving cattle from pasture, and sawing wood for the winter hearth. In such moments he forgot the infallible authority he wielded in his tiny dominion, the schoolroom, and became the very embodiment of courtesy and affability. By fondling the children, especially the youngest, he won the mother's favor. Like a lion once cradling a lamb, he He would sit for hours with a toddler on his knee, gently rocking the cradle with his foot, besides his other duties. He served as choir master, pocketing a fair number of bright silver shillings by teaching the local youth to sing psalms. On Sundays, when he took his place before the select singers in the church gallery, his pride swelled. In his heart, he believed the palm of supremacy belonged to him rather than the minister. His thunderous voice drowned out the congregation, and to this day strange roulades and wails echo in that church. Indeed, they say such sounds may still be heard half a mile away, across the mill pond, direct descendants of Ichabod's own vocal flourishes. Thus, by means of little tricks and devices, by fair means or foul, our worthy pedagogue earned a decent living, though those ignorant of the demands of intellectual laborer's life seemed astonishingly easy and carefree. The village schoolmaster was generally a figure of respect among the womenfolk. He was regarded as a gentleman of sorts, closer to the gentry than to the rough farm lads, surpassed in learning only by the parson. His arrival at a farmhouse could cause a flutter at the tea-table, an extra dish of pastries, perhaps even the ceremonial silver teapot. For these reasons, our man was also fortunate in the smiles of the local maidens. What a sight he presented between Sunday services, shining in their company in the churchyard. He plucked clusters of wild grapes from the trees, read aloud every epitaph, and strolled along the mill pond's edge surrounded by a bevy of girls, while the clumsy village swains trailed behind, bursting with envy at his ease and gallantry. His semi-nomadic life made him a kind of wandering gazette, carrying baskets of gossip from house to house. So he was always welcomed with a certain pleasure. Moreover, the women admired his learning, for he had read several books cover to cover and knew by heart Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft in New England, in whose infallibility he devoutly believed. In sum, he was a curious blend of cunning and simplicity. His passion for the supernatural and his ability to digest the most indigestible tales were truly remarkable, and both grew stronger in this enchanted region. No tale was too coarse or absurd for his voracious imagination. How often, after school, would he stretch himself on a bed of clover by the brook and pore over Mather's dreadful stories, until twilight wrapped the page in shadow. And when he walked home through swamp and forest, every sound of nature in that bewitched hour unsettled his heated fancy. The whippoorwill's cry, the croak of the tree frog, the mournful hoot of the owl, or the sudden rustle of a startled bird. Even the fireflies, flaring brightest in the darkest places, made him halt in terror when one blazed suddenly before him. Should a blundering beetle brush against him in flight, he was ready to expire with fright, convinced he had been touched by a wizard. His only remedy was to chant psalms, and the simple folk of Sleepy Hollow, sitting on their doorsteps at night, often shuddered at his nasal melodies drifting from the distant hill or misty road. Another source of his eerie delights were the long winter evenings spent with Dutch crones by the fireside, while apples hissed and popped in the hearth. He listened to tales of spirits, haunted fields, bridges, and streams, above all of the Headless Horseman, the Hessian of the Hollow. In return, he regaled them with stories of witchcraft, omens, and mysterious sounds, frightening them nearly senseless with talk of comets, falling stars, and the alarming fact that the earth spins, leaving them half the day upside down. Yet if he found endless pleasure in such company, he paid dearly for it on his solitary walk home. What phantoms and shadows beset him in the dim light of a snowy night! How wistfully he gazed at the distant windows gleam! How often he froze before a snow-laden bush that loomed like a shrouded specter! How often he trembled at the sound of his own footsteps, fearing to look back lest some monster stalked him! And how often the winds howled through the trees nearly drove him to faint, for he fancied that the galloping Hessian, forever in search of his head. These were but the ordinary fears of night, phantoms of a wandering imagination. Daylight dispelled them all. But Ichabod Crane might have lived a tranquil life, had he not encountered a creature far more troublesome than ghosts, goblins, or witches combined. That creature was woman. Smooth, lumbering pigs, fattened for slaughter, grunted contentedly as they basked in the coolness of the sty. From time to time, squads of playful piglets would dash outside, snuffling the air with their little snouts. A brilliant squadron of snow-white geese, escorting an innumerable fleet of ducks, sailed slowly and majestically along the neighboring pond. Regiment of turkeys filled the yard with their clamor. Guinea fowl, shrieking with piercing, irritable cries, bustled about like quarrelsome housewives. Before the barn door strutted a gallant rooster, model husband, warrior, and gentleman. He flapped his shining wings, crowed with joy and pride, then tore at the earth, only to summon his eternally hungry wives and children with noble generosity to share the morsel he had uncovered. At the sight of all these delights, promising sumptuous feasts for the long winter, our pedagogue's mouth watered. His ravenous imagination pictured every piglet as a pudding-stuffed roast with an apple in its jaws, pigeons he lovingly arranged into a pie beneath a golden, crackling crust. Geese swam in their own fat, while ducks, like newlyweds tenderly pressed together, lay upon a platter drenched in onion sauce. In the pigs he foresaw bacon, fat, tender, and fragrant melting ham. The turkey hovered before his eyes, suspended on a spit, neck tucked beneath his wing, perhaps girdled with a string of delicious sausages. The regal rooster with golden comb, stretched upon his back, claws raised in supplication, seemed to beg for mercy. Mercy denied him in life by his knightly spirit, while Ichabod, enraptured by this vision of abundance, indulged in such dreams, his wide green eyes darting from lush pastures to fields heavy with wheat, rye, corn, and buckwheat, then to orchards bending beneath rosy fruit around the warm Van Tassel homestead. His heart longed for the heiress of these riches. His imagination seized upon the thought of turning such wealth into ready coin, and coin into boundless tracts of wild frontier land, with timbered mansions in some distant settlement. More than that, his lively fancy pictured blooming Katrina atop a settler's wagon, surrounded by a brood of children, pots and kettles clattering below the wheels, while himself rode beside on a pacing mare, foal trotting faithfully behind, bound for Kentucky, Tennessee, or heaven knows where. Crossing the threshold of the house, he knew his heart was conquered irrevocably. It was one of those spacious farmhouses with steep, low-hanging roofs, inherited from the first Dutch settlers. The eaves drooped low, forming a veranda that could be closed against foul weather. Chains, harness, farm tools, and fishing nets hung beneath the roof, while benches lined the veranda for summer use. At one end stood a great spinning wheel, at the other a churn, signs of its many uses. From here Ichabod entered the hall, the heart of the Van Tassel home, the family's gathering place. His eyes were dazzled by rows of gleaming pewter neatly arranged on the buffet shelves. In one corner lay a huge sack of wool ready for spinning. In another, freshly woven homespun cloth. Corn cobs, strings of dried apples and peaches hung in cheerful patterns along the walls, interspersed with bright clusters of red peppers. A half-open door revealed the parlor, where claw-footed chairs and mahogany tables shone like mirrors. The hearth, with shovel and tongs, glimmered beneath dangling sprigs of asparagus. Artificial oranges and great seashells adorned the mantel, above which hung strings of colored eggs. From the ceiling dangled a giant ostrich egg. In a cabinet, deliberately left ajar, glittered treasures of antique silver and carefully mended porcelain. Having wandered through this fairy tale realm, Ichabod lost all peace of mind, his thoughts fixed upon one goal, to win the favor of Van Tassel's incomparable daughter. Yet the task before him was far harder than those faced by the knights of old, who battled giants, magicians, and dragons, or broke through iron gates and adamantine walls to rescue their ladies. Such feats they performed as easily as we reached the filling of Christmas pie, after which the maiden's hand was theirs. Ichabod, however, had to penetrate the heart of a village coquette, guarded by whims and caprices, and offended by a host of rivals, sturdy flesh-and-blood suitors, jealously watching one another yet ready to unite against a newcomer. Foremost among them was a burly, boisterous young man named Abraham, or, in Dutch fashion, Brom Van Brunt, the local hero, famed for his exploits and strength. Broad-shouldered, muscular, with short curly hair and a rough yet merry, bold face, he was nicknamed Brom Bones, known far and wide. A superb horseman, he rode like a Tartar, ever present at races and cockfights, and, by virtue of his strength, often acted as arbiter in disputes, his tilted cap and commanding tone silencing all objections. Always ready for a brawl or prank, he was more mischievous than malicious. His nature overflowed with youthful, riotous cheer. Surrounded by 3 or 4 companions who idolized him, he roamed the countryside, appearing at every quarrel and frolic for miles around. In winter he was recognized by his fur cap crowned with foxtail, and whenever farmers glimpsed ahead of a band of reckless riders, they braced for trouble. At midnight his gang would gallop past farmhouses, shouting like Cossacks, so that old women, startled awake, would mutter, "Ah, it's Brombones and his crew again." Neighbors feared him, yet admired and loved him, attributing every prank and fight to his hand. This roguish hero had lately set his sights on blooming Katrina, making her the object of his clumsy courtship. Though his attentions resembled a bear's rough caresses, rumor whispered she did not entirely reject them. Whether true or not, it was warning enough for other suitors, who quickly withdrew. None dared contest a lion's claim. Thus, whenever Brom's horse stood tethered at Van Tassel's fence on a Sunday evening, a sure sign its master was wooing within, all rivals passed by in despair, shifting their campaigns elsewhere. Such was the formidable adversary Ichabod Crane now faced. A stronger man might have abandoned the contest. A wiser one despaired. But Ichabod's nature combined gentleness with persistence. In body and spirit he resembled a reed, pliant yet resilient. Though he bent beneath pressure, he never broke. He yielded for a moment, then snap, straightened again, head held high. To challenge Brom openly would have been madness, for Brom tolerated no obstacles in love, and was a suitor more ardent than Achilles himself. Ichabod therefore began a slow, cautious, seemingly imperceptible advance. Under cover his role as singing master, he often visited the Van Tassel farm. Not that he feared parental interference. Balt Van Tassel was indulgent, loving his daughter even more than his pipe, and as a wise father, allowed her freedom. His worthy wife was wholly absorbed in household and poultry yard, wisely judging that ducks and geese were mad creatures needing supervision, while girls could take care of themselves. Thus, while she bustled about or spun at one end of the veranda, and Balt puffed his evening pipe at the other, watching the little wooden warrior atop the barn fight the wind with twin swords, Ichabod courted the daughter by the spring beneath the elm, or strolling the yard at twilight, when all favors the eloquence of lovers. I confess, I have never known by what precise means a woman's heart is besieged and at last conquered. To me it has always remained a mystery, a source of genuine wonder. At times such a heart has a vulnerable spot, a single entrance. At others, it is approached by 1,000 paths, so that mastery may be won by 1,000 stratagems. Victory over the first is the triumph of skill and ingenuity. But the highest proof of strategic talent lies in holding dominion over the second, for there a man must fight at every gate and every loophole. He who wins 1,000 ordinary hearts gains a certain renown, but he who secures absolute sway over the heart of a coquette is the true hero. Formidable Bones was no such hero, and scarcely had Ichabod begun his cautious advance, when Brom's hopes began to fade. No longer was his horse seen of a Sunday evening tethered at Van Tassel's fence. Between him and the pedagogue of Sleepy Hollow, there flared a rivalry to the death. Brom, not devoid of a rough and savage chivalry, was willing enough to bring matters to open combat, to settle the dispute in the fashion of those plain-dealing knights of old, that is to say, by duel. But Ichabod knew too well the balance of strength to accept such a challenge. He heard Brom's boast that he would fold the schoolmaster double and stow him on the top shelf of his own classroom, and he took care never to give opportunity for the threat to be fulfilled. His persistent, obstinate pacifism drove Brom to fury. Left with no other recourse, Brom unleashed the arsenal of rustic wit, showering his rival with coarse jests and pranks. Poor Ichabod became the target of Bones's riotous gang. They invaded his once peaceful domain, smoked out his singing school by stopping the chimney, and one night broke into the classroom, raising such a pandemonium that the poor pedagogue might well believe witches were holding Sabbath there. Worst of all, Brom sought every chance to make Ichabod ridiculous before the mistress of his heart. He trained his ill-bred dog to whine and yelp comically, then presented Katrina as a rival to Ichabod, equally fit to initiate her into the mysteries of psalmody. Days passed, yet neither side gained ground. One golden autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat dreamily upon his high chair, his throne, surveying the life of his little kingdom. In his hand he held the ruler, scepter of despotic power. The rod of justice hung behind him on 3 nails. Before him lay a heap of confiscated contraband, pop guns, tops, apple cores, fly cages, and whole legions of paper fighting cocks. The scene bespoke a recent act of stern justice. Pupils bent over their books, whispering slyly, casting furtive glances at their implacable master. Suddenly the silence was broken by the arrival of a Negro, clad in coarse woolen jacket and trousers, his head crowned with the crown of a hat resembling Mercury's cap. Mounted upon a shaggy, half-wild colt, guided only by a rope, he knocked at the door and solemnly invited Ichabod to a gathering that very evening at Katrina Van Tassel's. Having delivered his message with pompous dignity, he leapt the brook and galloped up the hollow, conscious of the urgency of his mission. In an instant the orderly classroom dissolved into chaos. Boys scampered to their lessons at breakneck speed. The nimblest skipped half their tasks unpunished, while the slower received sharp reminders upon their softer parts, which lent them sudden agility. Books were flung about, inkstands overturned, benches toppled. The school was deserted an hour before its time, and the pupils, like a legion of young imps, shrieked and tumbled across the meadow, rejoicing in their unexpected freedom. As for Ichabod, he spent no less than half an hour at his toilette. He brushed and cleaned his best, and indeed only, black suit, now much the worse for wear, and before a fragment of broken mirror smoothed his hair with care. To appear before his lady in the guise of a true cavalier, he borrowed a horse from his host, old Hans van Ripper, a choleric Dutchman, and mounted at last, setting forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventure. The steed was a worn-out plough horse, past all prime save its temper, gaunt and shaggy, with a neck like a ew's and a hammer-shaped head, its faded mane and tail tangled with burrs, one eye a ghastly white blur, the other blazing with the devil's fire. It was called Gunpowder, and in former days had been the favorite mount of fiery Hans van Ripper. Though decrepit, some remnant of its master's old passion still smoldered within. Ichabod was a fitting rider for such a steed. His knees rose nearly to the saddle-bow. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshopper legs. His whip held aloft like a scepter, and as the horse jolted him along, he flapped his arms like wings. His woolen cap sat low upon his brow. The skirts of his coat fluttered over the horse's tail. Such was the spectacle as they passed through Van Ripper's gate, a sight rare indeed in broad daylight. It was a glorious autumn day. The sky was clear, the woods arrayed in sober browns and golds, while more delicate trees, touched by frost, gleamed with orange, crimson, and scarlet. High overhead streamed lines of wild ducks. Squirrels chattered in the groves. From the stubble came the plaintive whistle of the quail. Smaller birds held their farewell gatherings, chirping and fluttering from bush to tree, carefree amid the season's abundance. As Ichabod jogged along, his ever-hungry eyes feasted upon autumn's treasures. Apples hung heavy on gnarled trees, filled baskets and barrels for market, or lay heaped in great piles for cider. Vast fields of corn lifted golden tassels, conjuring visions of cakes and puddings. Pumpkins, round and sunlit, recalled luscious pies. Beyond lay buckwheat fields, breathing the spicy fragrance of the apiary, and in fancy he tasted the golden pancakes, dripping with honey or molasses, served by Katrina's plump little hand, with its dimples and charms. Feeding his imagination with sweet thoughts and sugary dreams, he rode along the chain of hills that offer one of the loveliest views of the mighty Hudson. The sun was sinking in the west. The mirrored expanse of the Tappan Zee lay still, save where a faint ripple stretched the blue shadow of a distant mountain. A few amber clouds hung motionless in the boundless sky, the calm air holding them in place. The horizon, first glowing with crimson gold, shifted to the tint of a ripe apple's golden-green skin, and at last deepened into the dark blue of the heavens. A slanting ray lingered upon the wooded ridges that overhung the river, casting leaden and purple shades upon the cliffs. Far off, a small boat drifted downstream, its idle sails drooping against the mast, and since the sky was reflected in the water, it seemed to float in air. Ichabod reached Van Tassel Castle toward evening, finding that the pride and flower of the countryside. Elderly farmers, gaunt and bony, appeared in homespun trousers and jackets, blue stockings, and great shoes with shining pewter buckles. Their wives, small and sprightly, wore plaited caps, short-waisted gowns, homespun skirts, scissors and pincushions at their belts, and calico bags at their sides. There were also blooming maidens, dressed much like their mothers, save for a straw hat, a ribbon, or a white frock hinting at city fashions, and young men in square-cut coats adorned with rows of polished brass buttons, their hair plaited into queues, especially those fortunate enough to procure eel skin, prized here as a tonic for growth. The true hero of the gathering, however, was Brom Bones, arriving astride his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature as wild and mischievous as its master, upon which no one but Brom could sit. He preferred unruly horses that threatened to break a rider's neck. A docile, well-trained mount he deemed unworthy of a spirited lad. It would be vain to attempt describing the world of wonders that opened to Ichabod's delighted gaze when he entered the Van Tassel parlor. Not so much the bevy of rosy-cheeked damsels, but the enchantment of a genuine Dutch feast, an autumn season of plenty. Heaven help us! What was not there? Cakes of every kind known only to the skillful Dutch housewives, nut cakes, melting ollecokes, crisp donuts, ginger cakes, honey cakes, and all the tribe of pastry. There were apple pies, peach pies, pumpkin pies, slices of ham and smoked beef, delicacies of plum preserves, peaches, pears, and quinces, stewed fish and roasted fowl, bowls of milk and cream. All were set out in cheerful disorder, with the family teapot steaming at the center. Blessed sight! Words fail to do justice to such a banquet. But Ichabod, unlike his historian, was in no haste and paid homage to every dish. His heart expanded as his stomach filled. Food lifted his spirits as wine does for others. While feasting, his wide eyes roved over the scene, and he smiled at the thought that one day he might be master of all this wealth. He dreamed of bidding farewell to the shabby schoolhouse, snapping his fingers at Hans Van Ripper and other greedy landlords, and driving away some hapless wandering teacher who dared address him as brother. Old Balt Van Tassel moved among his guests, his round, cheerful face glowing like the full moon. His hospitality was brief but hearty. Handshakes, shoulder pats, booming laughter, and the constant exhortation to eat and be merry. Then music summoned them to dance. The fiddler was an aged, gray-headed Negro, who for half a century had been the wandering orchestra of the district. His instrument was as battered as himself, with but 2 or 3 strings, yet every stroke of the bow was matched by a nod of his head and a stamp of his foot whenever a new couple joined the floor. Ichabod prided himself on dancing as much as on singing. Not a muscle or sinew was idle. His jerking figure, his stamping feet, made him seem like St. Vitus himself, patron of dancers. He delighted the crowd of Negroes who thronged every window and door, their shining faces piled in pyramids, eyes rolling, teeth flashing, mouths agape with wonder. And he, who so mercilessly flogged his pupils, could he feel aught but joy now? For the lady of his heart was his partner, smiling sweetly at his amorous glances, while Brom Bones, consumed by love and jealousy, sulked in a corner. When the dancing ended, Ichabod joined the circle of sages on a veranda, smoking and recounting tales of the war. This region had been rich in heroes and exploits, lying near the lines of British and American fortifications, and thus a stage for marauders and border knights of every sort. Enough time had passed for each storyteller to embellish his deeds with fancy, casting himself as hero in the mist of memory. Yet all these war stories paled beside the ghostly legends that followed. This land abounded in tales of spirits, for such secluded Dutch settlements were fertile soil for superstition, and the influence of Sleepy Hollow spread like a mist, infecting the air with dreams and visions. Guests from the Hollow soon regaled the company with chilling stories. Funeral processions, wails near the great tree where Major Andre was captured, the woman in white haunting Raven Rock, and above all, the the Headless Horseman, the spectre most beloved of all, said to ride nightly and tether his steed among the graves by the church. The church, by virtue of its secluded position, had long been a favorite haunt of restless spirits. It stood upon a low knoll, ringed with acacias and mighty elms. Its neatly whitened walls gleamed against the dark, desolate background with a modest purity that recalled Christian humility and chastity. A gentle slope led down from it to a silver ribbon of water, bordered by tall, spreading trees, through which the blue hills of the Hudson could be glimpsed. Looking upon the grass-grown churchyard, where the sunbeams lay so peacefully, one might think a secure refuge, where the dead would rest forever in quiet and repose. On one side stretched a deep wooded hollow. Among shattered rocks and storm-felled trunks a torrent raged and roared. Not far away, where the stream grew deep, its banks were once joined by a wooden bridge. The road and bridge lay hidden in the dense shade of towering trees, so that even at noon a twilight reigned, and at night a pitchy darkness. This was one of the Headless Horseman's favorite haunts, where he was most often encountered. A tale was told of old Brower, a stubborn skeptic who scoffed at spirits, yet he was forced to ride behind the phantom horseman returning to his graveyard. They galloped heedless through bush and brake, hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge. There the horseman turned suddenly into a skeleton, hurled Brower into the torrent, and vanished in a thunderous flash, borne aloft among the treetops. Another story followed, more astonishing still, involving Brom Bones himself. He claimed the Hessian was a passionate rider. One night, returning from Sing Sing, Brom was overtaken by the midnight horseman. He challenged him to a race, pledging a bowl of punch if defeated. Through the hollow daredevil kept the phantom steed behind, but as they reached the church bridge, the spectre surged ahead, burst into a fiery blaze, and disappeared. These tales, told in the low, even tones of men speaking in darkness, and the faces of listeners lit now and then by the sudden glow of a pipe, sank deep into Ichabod's soul. He repaid the pleasure with long passages from his treasured cotton mather, adding accounts of strange happenings in Connecticut and of the dreadful spirits he had met in his wanderings about Sleepy Hollow. The merriment gradually subsided. Farmers gathered their families into wagons and drove away, the rumble of wheels echoing for a time in the valley and on the distant hills. Some maidens rode pillion behind their swains, their laughter mingling with the clatter of hoofs. Fading into silence, where noise and gaiety had reigned, all was now deserted and still. Only Ichabod lingered, hoping for the customary tete-a-tete with the wealthy heiress. More than ever he believed success was near. What passed between them I cannot say, but I fear something went amiss. He left her quickly, in deep dejection. Ah, women! Perhaps the coquette had played her part, feigning favor to lure her rival. Heaven alone knows. Enough that Ichabod departed looking more like a thief who had failed to steal chickens than a suitor who had failed to win a heart. Ignoring the riches that had so often dazzled his greedy eyes, he went straight to the stable, roused his steed with cuffs and blows, and forced the poor beast from its warm stall, where it had been dreaming of fields of clover and timothy. Heavy-hearted, soul cast down, Ichabod set out homeward along the high hills above Tarry Town, the same hills he had crossed so joyfully earlier. It was now the hour of spirits, as gloomy as Ichabod himself. Far below stretched the dark, indistinct surface of the Tappan Zee. Here and there small vessels lay at anchor, their tall masts swaying gently. In the dead stillness of midnight, he heard even the bark of a dog across the Hudson, faint and distant, reminding him how far away was that faithful companion of man. At times the long crow of a rooster drifted from some lonely farm among the hills, sounding like an echo from another world. Around him was no sign of life, save the melancholy chirp of a cricket or the guttural croak of a frog in the nearby swamp. All the ghost stories of the evening crowded his memory. The night grew darker. Stars seemed to sink into the abyss of heaven, clouds drifting across to hide them. Never had Ichabod felt so lonely, so oppressed. He was nearing the very places haunted by spirits. In the road stood a great tulip tree, towering above its fellows, its gnarled branches twisted fantastically, thick as trunks themselves, sweeping down to ground and rising again. This was a tree of Major Andre, captured here, and the common folk regarded it with awe and fear, mingling pity for the unfortunate officer with tales of strange visions and mournful sounds. As Ichabod approached, he began to whistle. It seemed answered, but it was only the wind rushing through the dead branches. Drawing nearer, he saw something white hanging in the tree. He halted, silent, then discovered it was but a lightning scar where the bark had been stripped. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, his knees drummed upon the saddle, but it was only the branches rubbing together in the wind. He passed safely, but new terrors awaited. 200 yards beyond, the road crossed a brook that vanished into a swamp known as Wiley Swamp. A rough bridge of logs spanned it. On one side, where the brook wound into the forest, a thicket of oaks and chestnuts, tangled with wild grapevine, cast a cavernous gloom. The crossing was dreaded, for here Andre had been seized, ambushed by sturdy yeomen. Ever since, the brook was thought bewitched, its thickets haunted. Many a schoolboy had trembled to cross alone after dark. As Ichabod neared the brook, his heart thumped wildly. He struck his horse, urging it to dash across, but instead the stubborn beast swerved the fence. The longer the delay, the greater his fear. He kicked and tugged in vain. At last the horse moved, only to plunge into the thicket. Ichabod lashed and spurred. Snorting and puffing, Gunpowder galloped forward, but the bridge stopped short, nearly pitching his rider headlong. At that instant, Ichabod's ear caught the muffled splashing of footsteps in the swamp. In the shadowy grove he saw a looming shape, motionless yet shrinking and swelling like some monstrous phantom poised to spring. The poor schoolmaster's hair bristled with terror. What was he to do? Turn back and flee, it was too late. And could he hope to escape a phantom, if phantom it was, borne upon the wings of the wind? Summoning all his resolve, with feigned courage, trembling and gasping, he cried, "Who's there?" No answer. He repeated the question, voice more agitated, but again no reply. He lashed old Gunpowder's flanks and, shutting his eyes, burst into psalmody with desperate faith. Then the dark shadow that filled him with dread stirred, climbed the bank, leapt, and in an instant stood in the middle of the road. Though the night was murky, he could discern the outline of a mighty horseman upon a great black steed. The figure showed neither hostility nor fellowship, keeping pace a little ahead on the blind side of poor Gunpowder. Ichabod, finding no comfort in this midnight companion, recalled Brumbones' encounter with the Hessian and urged his horse forward, hoping to leave the stranger behind. But the rider matched his pace. Ichabod slowed to a walk. So did the phantom. His heart shrank within him. He tried to sing again, but his parched tongue clove the roof of his mouth. The grim silence of the pursuer was more dreadful than words. Soon his worst fears were realized. The road rose, and the figure loomed against the sky, cloaked like a giant, and Ichabod saw with horror that it had no head. Worse still, the head dangled at the saddle-bow. Despair seized him. He rained blows upon Gunpowder, hoping to break away. The spectre spurred likewise. Stones flew, sparks flashed beneath the pounding hooves. Ichabod bent low, his lank frame stretched along the horse's neck, coat-tails streaming in the wind. They reached a road that turned towards Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, maddened by fear, swerved left, plunging into the sandy glen. This path led to the haunted bridge and the white church beyond. In the frantic race, Ichabod gained some ground, but midway the girth gave way. The saddle slipped. He clutched the pommel, then seized the horse's neck just as the saddle fell, crushed beneath the pursuing steed. He shuddered at Hans Van Ripper's wrath, his master's precious saddle lost, but terror left no room for such thoughts. The phantom pressed close. Ichabod, an awkward rider, slid from side to side, bruised by the horse's sharp spine, fearing he would be cleft in twain. Glimpses of starlight through the trees gave him hope. The bridge must be near. A silver reflection in the stream confirmed it. He saw the church walls gleaming faintly. He remembered Brumbones' tale. The spectre vanished at the bridge. If I reach it, I am saved, he thought. At that moment he heard the snort and breath of the black steed behind, hot upon his neck. One last desperate stroke, and gunpowder thundered across the bridge, clattering over the planks, and gained the far bank. Ichabod turned to see if the phantom would dissolve in flame or smoke. Instead, the rider rose in his stirrups, swung, and hurled his head. Ichabod tried to dodge, but too late, the ghastly missile struck with a crash. He fell senseless in the dust, while horse, spectre, and whirlwind swept past. Next morning, Gunpowder was found grazing quietly at his master's gate, without saddle, reins trailing. Ichabod did not appear at breakfast, nor at dinner. The school children idled by the brook, their teacher gone. Hans Van Ripper fretted for his saddle, as much as for the pedagogue. Searchers found a broken saddle, hoof prints of a furious chase, and by the stream, Ichabod's hat and a shattered pumpkin. No body was ever found. Hans examined the poor man's bundle. 2½ shirts, neckcloths, woolen stockings, old corduroy breeches, a rusty razor, a psalm book dog-eared throughout, and a broken pitch pipe. His books, Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, an almanac, and a dream interpreter filled with scribbled verses to Katrina, were condemned to the flames. His quarter's wages had vanished with him. The mystery stirred much gossip. Some declared Ichabod was carried off by the Headless Horseman. Others whispered he had fled, spurned by Katrina, fearful of ghost and landlord alike. Years later, a farmer reported seeing him in New York, alive, practicing law, dabbling in politics, writing for newspapers, and serving as a magistrate. Brom Bones soon married blooming Katrina, and whenever the tale was told, his sly grin and hearty laugh at mention of the pumpkin suggested he knew more than he confessed. Yet the village gossip still insists Ichabod was spirited away, and the story remains a fireside favorite. The bridge inspires greater dread than ever, and the old schoolhouse fell to ruin, said to be haunted by the pedagogue's ghost. Farmers returning late from the fields swear they hear his mournful psalms drifting through the twilight of Sleepy Hollow.